Hello and welcome back to the podcast with Sarah and James. In today's episode, we are exploring 5 of the strangest trends in history. Now, it's always tempting to look back at the past and think, well, that's just a bit weird, but that's not what we're doing today.
Uh, it's there's that phrase about the past being a foreign country and doing things differently there. So I always look at it and think, well, a lot of what they do is just seems very, very weird.
Yeah, and it was, but usually there is a lot more, or there was a lot more going on behind it, and that's what we're interested in today, because a lot of these so-called crazy trends, they weren't random at all, even though they appear that way. People had reasons for them, sometimes very serious reasons, and at the time, what we now perceive as weird would have made perfect sense.
Yeah,
Now, across all of history, people have tried to turn their ideas about health, society, money, nature, all sorts of things into something physical, something you could actually see and experience.
okay. So they they weren't really trends as we would think of them, but more like
No.
belief systems or philosophies just being carried out in their everyday lives.
Yeah, exactly. And
Okay,
sometimes that
yeah,
meant designing entire landscapes around an idea. Sometimes it meant creating social rules or rituals. And sometimes people genuinely believed they could control invisible forces through design or certain behaviour. And occasionally it meant hiring a hermit to live in your garden.
which sounds absolutely ridiculous until
Yeah.
you realise that there was something like an actual meaning behind it, or they thought there was a meaning behind it.
Yeah. And that's really what this episode is about. So let's talk about the garden hermit trend.
Oh, garden hermits. What a brilliant place to start.
Yes, I thought we should because honestly, it sounds completely made up.
It does,
But
yeah.
in the late 18th century, especially in Britain, wealthy landowners started adding something very unusual to their estates. Not just statues or fountains or fancy gardens, they would have had all that as well, but actual hermits.
Actual hermits. These weren't
Actual
just your,
hermits.
yeah, they weren't your religious hermits. Well, they're not like the monks who've gone to live out in the middle of nowhere just to get away from society.
No, they weren't, and that's the important bit. These hermits were basically part of the landscape design, almost like a garden feature. And at the time, a grand estate wasn't just supposed to show off wealth, it was also meant to reflect ideas about nature, simplicity, and living more authentically.
Yeah, so your garden becomes more of a statement.
Exactly. And some
Yeah,
landowners took that idea very seriously. They'd build little rustic huts hidden away in wooded parts of the estate, and then they would hire someone to actually live there as a hermit. And sometimes they'd provide books and furniture and food and a list of rules.
yeah. It's this is sort of the bit where it becomes slightly, how to put it delicately, unhinged, mad, unhinged.
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah,
Because in some cases, the hermit was expected to stay fully in character, so not cut their hair, barely
brilliant.
speak, and generally act as this living symbol of solitude and reflection. And sometimes guests visiting the estate, they would be literally shown the hermit during walks around the grounds. So it's kind of like,
Brilliant.
here we have our resident hermit,
Yeah.
you know.
You're not, yeah, they've not hired a person, they've installed an atmosphere.
Yeah, or an idea. They were
Yeah.
basically trying to make solitude into something physical, something people could actually see as part of the landscape. And what's mad is that there were even adverts for these roles in some cases. Landowners would be
Brilliant.
looking for someone willing to live on their estate as a resident hermit for years at a time.
Yeah, I might have to check LinkedIn to see if there's any on there because,
Yeah.
it is one of the strangest job descriptions I've ever heard of.
Yeah, and there are some very strange jobs in history. But the role wasn't really about survival or escaping society, it was more like a performance. The hermit became part of the experience, as you said earlier, of the estate. So there are even accounts of owners giving very specific instructions, like what the hermit should wear, whether they were allowed to speak to visitors, what they were allowed to say, things like that.
So basically, it's almost as if they've outsourced authenticity.
That's actually a really good way of describing it. And because there's this strange contradiction at the centre of all of this, they
Mm.
were trying to create something natural through something completely staged. Now, at the time, especially with romantic ideas becoming popular, nature was being idolised. People wanted landscapes that felt emotional, reflective, even a bit wild, but still very carefully designed. So these estates became more than just gardens. They were almost like controlled experiences where every detail was supposed to mean something, even the hermit.
Yeah. And eventually, thankfully, this trend eventually dies out.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a
Yeah.
hermit in the garden, but no, I'm joking. By the
You
early
married him.
19th century, yeah, I did. By the early 19th century, it starts fading away, partly because fashions changed, but also because people began to realise the contradiction in it all. So the
Mm.
whole thing was supposed to feel authentic and natural, but the more you thought about it, the more staged it seemed.
So people became wise to it, stopped believing in this illusion.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it became harder
Right.
to take seriously once people realised you can't really manufacture authenticity. Can't say the word authenticity. You know what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say? Don't
Authenticity.
make me say it again
Yeah.
without
Yeah.
it feeling artificial.
Yeah.
So, yeah, bit weird. Now,
Yeah.
another earlier example, moving on, is what was happening in the Dutch Republic in the 1630s. So we're going back a bit. And this was when tulips became more than just flowers. They basically turned into something people speculated on. And just to clarify, with these 5 trends that I've picked out to talk about, none of them are related in any way. It's
Okay. Yeah.
just trends in general. In case you think, why have you gone from hermits to tulips? Weird. Anyway,
Garden
so with
again.
the
Yeah.
tulips, you've got your rare varieties, especially ones with unusual colour patterns. They started being traded for huge amounts of money. And at the peak of it, a single bulb could be worth more than a house.
Wow. So I suppose
Yeah.
it's another one of those things. It's always feels that little bit more unbelievable, I suppose. But it's not just that because these things happened, but that at the time it was normal. Nobody thought twice about it. It was just something that
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah, and it wasn't happening in the background either. It was happening quite visibly in everyday life. People were talking about tulips the way we might talk about property or investments now, comparing them, trading them, tracking their value, and some were even sold before they'd properly grown, based entirely on what people thought they would be worth.
Yeah, I don't know why, but the word Bitcoin has sprung to mind. Anyway, so
Yeah.
basically, they're trading the expectation of what this bulb could
Mm-hmm.
become rather than the actual thing.
Yes. And you made a really good point when you said Bitcoin, because it's with these trends, it's kind of every trend that we will cover in this podcast, you could relate to a trend that has existed or exists today.
Yeah.
That's kind of what. But anyway, um, so yeah, you're exactly right. In some cases, bulbs would change hands multiple times in a short space of time, with the price going up and up and up. And almost like the act of trading itself was what was creating the value in the first place.
Okay, interesting. So it starts to sound less like chaos and
Mm.
idiocy and more like a
Idiocy.
system that is actually working. So
Yeah.
it's just based on the belief instead of anything physical. Again, it's what this could become.
Yes, and that's the key thing.
Mad.
From the outside, it can look completely irrational. It does
Yeah,
feel completely irrational.
it
But
does. Yeah,
inside, it probably felt structured and logical. Because if everyone around you believes something is worth more tomorrow than it is today, then buying into it doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like keeping up.
did I mention the word Bitcoin? Um,
Mm.
so it's gone from almost, it's not really about the tulip at all, but more the agreement around it.
Exactly. Nothing about the flower has changed. A
No,
tulip was still a tulip, but the meaning attached to it, the shared agreement about its importance, that expanded far beyond what it physically was.
and I suppose that kind of agreement only works as long as everyone just keeps believing in it. Don't question it, just believe it.
Yes, and that's where things
Nothing wrong with
start
it.
to shift because at
Yeah,
some point that agreement begins to weaken, not all at once, but gradually there are small hesitations, a few people decide not to buy, a few sales not going through, and once
yeah,
that starts, the system holding everything together begins to loosen.
yeah. So like confidence breaking before the actual collapse happens.
Exactly, and very quickly, what felt stable becomes uncertain, and the same objects that once carried enormous value suddenly don't anymore.
Yeah, yeah. It's strange how fast that flips once people's belief in it changes and sort of starts to dissipate.
It really is. And it's hard not to notice that pattern, as I said before, that pattern repeating in different forms throughout history, especially when societies try to explain forces they can't actually see.
Yeah,
And that idea of invisible forces shaping very real outcomes, that leads us into our next trend because it doesn't stop with money or markets. It shows up again in something much more personal, something that touches everyday life, health, and even the design of entire cities. Because for a long time in Europe, the dominant explanation for disease wasn't about germs or bacteria at all. It was something called miasma theory.
yeah. That's one of those ideas which sounds completely wrong. I suppose is the best way I think of it. It's wrong now, but only because we know better. We know what came after that.
That's right. And the basic idea at the time was simple, at least on the surface. Disease was caused by bad air. Not air in a modern scientific sense, but air
Yeah,
that had become corrupted, stagnant, poisoned by decay or waste or foul smells.
yeah. So it's taking a, a a very real observation, bad conditions, bad smells, and turning it into a full explanation for illness.
Yeah, and that's exactly why it made sense at the time. Because if you lived in a
Mm,
world or in that world, it wasn't a wild idea. Illness often did seem to appear in dirty, overcrowded, poorly ventilated
yeah,
places. So the conclusion that people reached wasn't unreasonable. It was just based on the information they had at the time.
yeah. I suppose once that's accepted as well, it changes how you look at everything.
It really does. And what's interesting is how deeply it shaped everyday life. So cities started to focus heavily on airflow, windows, ventilation, open spaces, all of that became really important, not just, well, it was almost morale. Bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were seen as warnings. So people used or even used perfumes and herbs and scented items. I mean, we've all heard of during the plague, people would,
Yeah,
the plague doctors would stuff herbs in the beaks and people would carry posies.
a
It
pocket
was,
full of posies. Yeah,
yes, it was them trying to cleanse the air around them because they genuinely believed it caused disease.
yeah. So you end up in a world where your smells become information, sort of
Yeah.
like a early warning system.
Yeah, Precisely. And in some cases, and again, I've just said this, I'm going to repeat myself, but people would carry these scented cloths or posies, so little flowers for those of you that don't know what a posy is, believing they were protecting themselves from this invisible contamination in the atmosphere. And it wasn't just a medical theory, it was a way of understanding and organising the world. Clean air meant safety, bad smells meant danger.
Yeah, that's actually quite a total system when you think about it.
Mm.
Even I'm beginning to believe it now. I'm going
Yeah.
to open a window. It's not
Yeah.
just your health, it's your environment, your behaviour, and even responsibility.
Yes, and that's really important. Health became something you managed through your environment, through
Yeah,
air, cleanliness, and avoidance of anything that might feel stagnant or unclean. Um, I mean, you probably wouldn't, if you walked into a room and it smelled awful, you probably wouldn't stay in that room. Not because you think it's going to give you a disease, but naturally your body would not want to stay in that room. And this has shaped how people have moved through cities, how they design their homes, and even how they thought about personal responsibility. Because if disease is carried on the air around you, which is what they thought,
yeah,
protecting yourself isn't just about treatment, it's about constant prevention, constant awareness of your environment.
yeah. So your everyday life is turned into something you're constantly actively managing.
Yeah, and from a modern perspective, now we know that this wasn't the full picture. Germ theory eventually replaced it, and the understanding of disease shifted completely. But that doesn't make the miasma theory just a mistake in a simple sense, because for its time, it was a coherent explanation of something people could clearly see happening,
Yeah,
even if the cause was misidentified.
yeah. And obviously, it still ends up shaping the world physically, even
Mm.
though that theory, the miasma theory itself, disappeared.
Absolutely. And like so many ideas in history, it shaped the world long before it was replaced by something more accurate.
Yeah,
So, not all of these systems were about things you couldn't see. Some of them were about making power completely visible. And the next trend, we're going back to medieval and early modern Europe. Justice. We're talking about justice. And at that time, justice wasn't something that happened quietly behind closed doors in the way we expect today. It was it was a public event, or it was often a public event, something you would gather to watch.
yeah. That is very. It feels very, very different to the relationship we have to justice today, and
Yes,
it's not private or procedural. It's shared experience.
that's right. So the trend then was that things like executions, punishments, and public trials were, in many cases, treated as civic occasions. So
Bring them back.
townspeople would attend, no, let's not, would attend in large numbers, crowds would form, and the process was structured, symbolic, and very deliberately staged because the point wasn't only to punish an individual, it was to communicate something to everyone watching. And that was what power looked like, what consequences looked like, and where authority sat in the world.
So less about the individual's case and
Yeah.
more about reinforcing that system itself.
Yeah, like making an example, really.
Yeah,
So, in that sense, these events, they weren't just legal processes, they were performances of order, a way of reinforcing the boundaries of society by making them physically visible. And there was a kind of logic to it, even if it feels quite uncomfortable now. Because in a world without mass media, without written enforcement systems reaching everyone instantly, the spectacle itself carried the message. You didn't
yeah,
just hear about justice, you saw it happen.
yeah. So it's that's the part that really changes how you interpret it, I suppose, because
Yeah,
from our perspective, it feels like a spectacle just for the sake of it being having a spectacle, but actually, it's more functioning like a communication to the wider world.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's important because what's striking is how communal it was. These weren't isolated moments hidden away from public life, they were embedded within it. So people attended these events as they would attend other major civic events. So there was a shared understanding that something important was being witnessed together. So it's kind of like, imagine saying, oh, instead of saying, oh, did you watch the game at the weekend? It was, oh, did you watch the beheading at the weekend? Do you
Yeah,
know, it was
yeah,
it was that casual.
yeah. I bet the BBC couldn't get that either.
No.
But I suppose for this, it's the community isn't just observing justice; it's taking part, it's participating in the meaning of justice.
That's exactly it. And from a modern perspective, it's very easy to focus on how harsh or alien this feels. But again, it comes back to the same pattern running through all of these trends. Societies simply using the tools they have, so in this case, visibility, ritual, and public gathering, to make abstract ideas like justice, in this case, feel real and undeniable. So, not just something written in law, something you could stand in front of and see for yourself.
Yeah, it also goes to explain why it changes later on, because once you have other ways of communicating authority, you don't need it to be physically performed in front of your crowds anymore.
No. And over time, this way of doing things did begin to change. From the 18th century onwards, but more noticeably into the 19th century, ideas about justice and punishment started to shift. So new legal systems developed. And with them came a growing emphasis on privacy and procedure and reform rather than
Yeah.
public display. So punishment was gradually moved away from the centre of public life, so away from your town squares and your large gatherings, and into prisons and courtrooms. And from there, it was no longer something you were expected to watch as part of civic participation.
Yeah. So it's like justice moves from being something you witness to
Mm.
something you just trust exists somewhere else.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way of putting it. Now, this wasn't an overnight change. Different places shifted at different speeds, and older practices lingered in some areas longer than others. But the overall direction was clear. Justice was becoming something that happened out of sight rather than in full view of the public.
So it's interesting that power hasn't disappeared. It's just changed how it's shown to the people.
That's right. And the spectacle element slowly faded. So, what had once been a shared public experience, something people gathered to witness together, became something more distant, more controlled, and more contained within institutions. Now, looking back, it does mark a broader change in how societies understood power itself, not as something that needed to be constantly demonstrated in
Yeah.
public, but something that could be enforced through systems that didn't rely on being seen. And in that sense, it's another example of the same pattern running through all of this, a shift from visible performance to invisible structure. So that's the justice system wrapped up nicely. But moving on, after justice moves out of the public square and into institutions, something else begins to fill that space in everyday life. A quieter system is happening, and this one reaches much further into ordinary behaviour because in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, social life across much of Europe becomes increasingly shaped by etiquette, detailed codes of behaviour that governed how people were expected to act, speak, sit, eat, and even gesture in different settings.
Yeah. So we're at the point where your behaviour becomes more structured, like there's an invisible rule book that everyone's following.
Absolutely. And these weren't just loose suggestions about manners. In many cases, they were highly structured expectations and they were written down in manuals and guides that circulated widely. And they told you how to present yourself in society in a way that signalled your class, your education, and your belonging.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting because it's not really about politeness, as you might think. It's more about the interpretation. So
Mm.
you're constantly being read by other people.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, actually, because even small actions carried meaning: how you greeted someone, how much eye contact was appropriate, how you moved through a room. Nothing was entirely neutral, almost everything had a correct form.
Yeah, so it's created a kind of social language that
Mm,
everyone needs to be able to speak fluently,
yeah.
even if no one actually goes out of their way to teach you it in real time.
Yes, it's one of those things that you were kind of expected to know. And what's interesting is when you look at it as a system. Etiquette wasn't just about politeness, it was about legibility, about making yourself readable to others and reading them in return. So it created a kind of shared language for social life where behaviour itself, so how you behave, that becomes a signal of identity and status.
Yeah, so you're doing something quite similar to other examples,
Mm,
and it's taking something abstract like your
yeah.
social position or belonging, and you're turning it into something which is visible to others.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And like so many of the trends that we talked about, it wasn't simply about restriction for its own sake, it was about order. And it was about making social life feel predictable and understandable and stable in a world that was changing quite quickly in other ways. So essentially, if you knew the rules, you knew where you stood.
Yeah, which probably makes it feel quite reassuring
Yeah.
if you're on the inside, even if it looks quite rigid from those by those looking outside from the
Yeah.
outside in.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. But over time, just like with the other systems we've looked at, these codes began to soften. So some became outdated and others were absorbed into a broader sense or broader ideas of general manners rather than
yeah,
strict social rules. So the sharper distinctions between that's correct, that's incorrect, that started to fade.
yeah. So it's become sort of less like your formal system,
Yeah.
and then it's become, I suppose, more like something most people just absorb culturally.
Yeah. So it's naturally, when you're in certain situations, you naturally know what's appropriate and what isn't, or most people do. Um, so many of these patterns, they still linger in different forms today, even if we don't always notice them. But the sense that everyday life had to be carefully performed according to right codes, that's largely loosened.
Yeah, so that's kind of connects everything we've looked at so far, because
Mm.
whether it's your markets, your health, justice, behaviour, it's always about making something invisible to appear more structured.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And that leaves you with something quite consistent across all of this, whether it's gardens, markets, medicine, justice, or social behaviour. You keep seeing the same instinct at work, the attempt to
Yeah,
take something complex and uncertain and turn it into something structured, visible, and repeatable.
yeah,
So, so, looking at all this together, it's easy to focus on how different each of these trends seems on the surface. Um, you've got a hermit in a garden, a flower becoming worth more than a house, invisible air carrying disease, justice performed in public, and then you've got behaviour reduced to carefully learned codes. And at first glance, they don't really seem like they belong in the same conversation, but the pattern underneath them is surprisingly consistent.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose once you take your step back to look at it and look at the wider picture, you
Mm.
start to see that they're all doing a similar kind of work. It just happens to be in very, very different areas of life.
Yeah, and across all of these moments in history, you can see people trying to make sense of forces that are either invisible, unstable, or difficult to control. So, value, health, danger, power, identity. These are things that matter deeply to everyday life, but they don't always have a clear physical form.
Yeah, so I suppose they've all come with that same challenge. How
Mm.
do you deal with something you can't fully see or you can't even hold?
Yeah, and in response to this, society's built systems around them. So, not just explanations, but actual structures, ways of making those ideas visible, repeatable, and easier to live with.
Now, and I suppose those structures become the reality that people actually live inside or try to
Ye-
live inside anyway.
Yeah, that's it. And sometimes that means turning ideas into landscapes, like the hermit in the
Yeah,
garden. Sometimes it means turning belief into markets, like the tulip trading. Sometimes it means turning invisible causes into environmental rules. So you've got your miasma theory.
yeah,
Sometimes it's turning authority into public performance, spectacle justice. And sometimes it means turning social life into a kind of language through etiquette and behaviour.
yeah. So it's less about the specifics
Mm.
and more about the pattern of the response.
Yeah. And what ties all of it together isn't just that these ideas were wrong or right in any simple sense, it's that they were attempts, often very structured, very thoughtful, but they were attempts to make the world feel more understandable than it actually is. So to take things that can't easily be seen and give them form.
Yeah, I suppose once you see it like that, it stops feeling just like a list of weird historical trends.
Yes, and in that way, these trends don't really feel like curiosities from a distant past. They actually feel like reminders of something quite familiar. So, whenever humans are faced with something uncertain or abstract or overwhelming, there's a strong tendency to build systems around it. It's just our way of
Yeah,
coping, I guess. So, we like to turn it into something we can point to, something we can organise our lives around, something that feels, at least for a while, a bit stable.
yeah, and then once you start noticing that pattern,
History stops feeling like a collection of strange behaviours.
yeah,
It starts to look like a series of very human attempts to make the invisible visible.
yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Okay, if anyone is looking for a hermit, Sarah is available for work.
Thank you very much.